August 1944, a dusty French roadside. A group of German prisoners waits under guard, expecting a truck to a standard POW camp. Instead, American MPs line them up along the highway and give them a single order: watch. For the next 6 hours, General Patton's Third Army roared past. Not just dozens of Sherman tanks, hundreds, miles of supply trucks, artillery, tank destroyers, fighter bombers dominating the sky. It was a display of American industrial power that simply never ended. One German officer later wrote, "In that moment, I knew Germany had lost. Not because we'd been defeated in battle, but because we could never match what we were seeing." Patton didn't just capture these men, he broke their will by showing them exactly why resistance was futile. He turned a traffic jam into a psychological weapon. Patton didn't just break the rules, he rewrote them. Standard Allied protocol was strict: capture the enemy, search them, and immediately ship them to the rear. The goal was to blind them, keep them far away from active operations to prevent intelligence gathering. But Patton did the exact opposite. To his own staff, his new order looked reckless, perhaps even dangerous. He ordered his MPs to position fresh prisoners right on the front lines of the logistics corridors. He wanted them to stare directly into the barrel of the American war machine. His intelligence officers were horrified. They asked, "Isn't it risky? They'll count our units, they'll identify our formations." Patton's response was cold and calculated. "I want them to count. I want them to see exactly how outmatched they are. And then I want them to tell every German bastard they meet that fighting us is suicide." The strategic brilliance wasn't in the violence, it was in the intimidation. Patton knew that if he could crush their morale, he wouldn't have to crush their bodies. What these prisoners saw next didn't just scare them, it fundamentally broke their reality. First, the armor. German panzer divisions had been whittled down to a handful of tanks, yet here they watched M4 Shermans roll by not in dozens, but in battalions. Hundreds of tanks, hour after hour, creating a wall of steel. Then the logistics. While the German army was starving for fuel and parts, American convoys stretched to the horizon. Thousands of trucks packed with ammo, food, and gasoline. Above them, American fighter bombers patrolled with casual arrogance, completely unchallenged by the Luftwaffe. But the final blow was the maintenance. When a German tank broke in 1944, it was abandoned. When an American tank broke, specialized vehicles recovered it and repaired it right in front of the prisoner's eyes. One Wehrmacht lieutenant captured the horror in his diary. "We'd been told American equipment was inferior. Then we watched their inferior tanks roll past for 4 hours without pause. Our entire panzer division at full strength had fewer tanks than passed in the first hour." Patton's officers watched the prisoners closely, documenting a predictable 3-stage psychological collapse. Stage 1 was denial. At first, their minds refused to accept the evidence of their own eyes. They were convinced it was a trick, a stage play. They whispered that the Americans must be driving the same tanks in a loop to create a false impression of strength. So they watched the bumper numbers. They looked for repeating faces, but the numbers never repeated. The faces were always new. That led to stage 2, horror. As the hours dragged on and the column never stopped, the math became undeniable. If one American army had this much material, and Germany was fighting 3 of them, the war wasn't just lost, it was impossible. By the end, the prisoners sat in stunned silence. The fight had simply left them. Interrogators noticed the shift immediately. Men who would have died for the fatherland suddenly gave up secrets without being asked. "What's the point?" they asked. "You clearly don't need my information." One captured German colonel summed it up perfectly to his interrogator. "You don't understand. We knew we were losing, but seeing your supply columns made me realize we never had a chance. You aren't fighting a war. You're conducting an industrial operation that just happens to involve combat." The intelligence windfall was immediate and staggering. Patton discovered that the most effective truth serum wasn't a chemical, it was a view of the highway. Prisoners began volunteering tactical data that standard interrogation could never extract. Why hide a defensive position when you know the Americans have enough artillery to grid erase the entire county? Why protect a supply line when the enemy has infinite trucks? It wasn't just grunts talking either. High-ranking staff officers began handing over detailed analyses of German supply shortages. Technical specialists explained the flaws in their own tanks. Even plans for underground guerrilla resistance were exposed. These men didn't feel like traitors. In their minds, they weren't betraying Germany. They were simply accepting physics. Patton's G2 intelligence section reported that prisoners who watched the roadside show were 60% more likely to provide actionable intelligence than those processed normally. The results were so undeniable that other American commanders quietly started asking Patton for his playbook. This tactic worked because it weaponized the truth against the lie. For years, Nazi propaganda had fed these soldiers a specific diet of falsehoods. They were told American equipment was mass-produced junk. They were told American soldiers were lazy amateurs. They were told that German wonder weapons would turn the tide at the last second. But standing by that road, the lie disintegrated. They saw junk tanks arriving in numbers that made German quality irrelevant. They saw amateur logistics functioning with clockwork precision that the Wehrmacht couldn't dream of matching. They realized that no secret weapon could ever survive under a sky so completely dominated by American air power. The cognitive dissonance was shattering. They hadn't just lost a battle, they had lost their worldview. One former Hitler Youth member, captured at just 17, wrote, "I'd been taught that Germans were supermen fighting Jewish-controlled American weaklings. Then I watched American tanks pass for 3 hours. I was 17, and I understood my entire life was a lie." Make no mistake, this wasn't accidental. Patton orchestrated these roadside shows with the precision of a movie director. Every detail was calculated for maximum psychological damage. Timing was everything. Prisoners weren't just dumped by the road. They were positioned during peak logistical hours, exactly where supply lines converged. This created an optical illusion of infinite density. A prisoner at a junction wouldn't see 2 columns. He'd see a single, unending river of steel. The duration was specific too, 4 to 6 hours, long enough to crush any skepticism, but short enough to keep the shock fresh. But the most brilliant detail was the silence. The MPs were ordered not to boast. They didn't brag, they didn't taunt. They just stood there and let the tanks do the talking. Crucially, it wasn't staged. The prisoners were watching real operations, not a parade. Soldiers know the difference between theater and war. And the fact that this was just a normal Tuesday for the Americans was the most terrifying part of all. The genius of the plan was that it didn't stop at the roadside. Patton created a psychological virus, and the prisoners carried it with them into the camps. Inside the wire, German POWs maintained their own hierarchies. The rumor mill was faster than a telegraph. New arrivals would whisper, "Did you get the Patton Roadshow?" It sparked fierce debates in the barracks. Prisoners who hadn't seen it accused the others of cowardice or exaggeration. The witnesses just shook their heads and said, "Wait until you see it. It's worse than you think." This despair killed resistance. Every camp had an escape committee, men dedicated to tunneling out and rejoining the fight, but Patton's alumni shut them down. They argued that escaping was pointless. Why tunnel out just to run back to an army that was already dead? One escape organizer wrote, "I was planning to tunnel out until I talked to men who'd watched Patton's tanks. They convinced me that escaping just meant delaying the inevitable. We were surrounded by an enemy with infinite resources. What was the point?" Word got out. Other Allied commanders saw the results and started copying Patton's homework. The British began marching prisoners past massive supply depots. The Canadians in Holland routed captured Germans past endless parks of waiting vehicles. Even the Soviets on the Eastern Front used a version of it. But while the Americans showed off machines, the Russians showed off men, forcing prisoners to watch column after column of fresh troops, demonstrating a manpower reserve that Germany had long since exhausted. The tactic spread because it was the perfect weapon. It cost $0, used zero ammunition, and had a 100% success rate. You didn't need to build a stage, you just had to pull back the curtain. But no one did it like Patton. For other commanders, it was a trick they used occasionally. For Patton, it was standard operating procedure. He industrialized psychological warfare just as effectively as he industrialized combat. The impact of this strategy echoed long after the last shot was fired. Patton wasn't just breaking their will for the war, he was programming their minds for the peace. When these prisoners finally returned home, they brought a specific message with them. You cannot fight America. This wasn't propaganda they heard on the radio. It was a fact they had seen with their own eyes. This grassroots reality check helped pave the way for the Marshall Plan. Germans knew that American pockets were deep enough to rebuild Europe because they had seen the overflow. Later, during the Cold War, this same memory served as a shield. West Germans who had stood by those roadsides knew that if the Soviets attacked, they were backed by an industrial giant that could outproduce the world. A German general later wrote the epitaph for the entire conflict. Historians will debate strategy, but every German soldier who watched American columns understood the real reason we lost. They could replace losses faster than we could inflict them. So, was it ethical? Technically, these men were already defeated. Was it necessary to rub their noses in it? Was it just Patton's ego, or was it legitimate strategy? It forces us to ask an uncomfortable question. Is it crueler to break a man's body with a bullet, or to break his soul with the truth? Patton didn't torture these men. He didn't starve them. He didn't violate the Geneva Convention. All he did was show them reality, the cold, hard math of American industrial supremacy. And that reality was more devastating than any physical blow. It worked. Intelligence flowed, escapes stopped, and the message, "You cannot win against this," was carried back to Germany, helping to end the war sooner. Patton understood that total victory means defeating the enemy's will to fight, not just their ability to shoot. And sometimes the most effective weapon isn't to bomb. It's the truth. Was this brilliant strategy or unnecessary humiliation? Let me know your honest take in the comments below. And if you want more uncomfortable truths about how wars are really won, make sure you subscribe.